The elevator doors opened, and Claire Bennett heard her own name before she saw who had said it. Not her married name, not the name on her paycheck. Her name, the one nobody in this city had spoken out loud in 15 years, said low and rough by a voice she recognized in her spine before her mind caught up. She stood very still in the doorway of an office that smelled like new carpet and old money, one hand still holding the strap of a purse that carried exactly $41, and she thought, he still knows how to say it like that, like it mattered, like it had always mattered. She had a choice to make in the next 3 seconds, and she had already made it before she understood she was making it. 3 weeks earlier, she owned nothing in this city except a 5-year-old boy and a folder of paperwork that said she used to be somebody's bookkeeper. Claire stood outside the glass doors of the Aldermont residences, with that folder pressed flat against her chest, like it could stop something from getting in, or maybe from getting out. The building went up 30 stories into a gray Tuesday sky, all steel and reflection, the kind of place that made a person feel smaller just for standing near it. She had walked 11 blocks to get here because the bus fare would have meant no milk for Toby's cereal in the morning. And 11 blocks in shoes with a separating sole was a decision a person made when they had already run out of other decisions. The posting had said custodial staff, Aldermont residences, immediate opening. It hadn't said who owned the building. Claire hadn't thought to ask. Why would she? Buildings had owners the way weather had a sky, technically true, but not something you needed to know the name of to survive under it. Inside, the lobby was cold, in a way that had nothing to do with air conditioning. An older woman behind a folding table near the service elevator looked up as Claire came in, taking in the resume folder, the shoes, the careful way Claire had pinned her hair that morning to look like someone who had her life together. "You here for the cleaning position?" the woman asked. She had a voice like gravel that had been rained on for years, and kind eyes that had learned not to show too much kindness too fast. "Yes, ma'am." "Rosa." The woman stuck out a hand. "I run the crew on the East Wing. You'll want the 14th floor, Human Resources office. Tell them Rosa sent you. It won't help, but it's polite." She almost smiled. "You got kids?" Claire hesitated. It was a strange question from a stranger, but something about the directness of it, the lack of pity in it, made her answer honestly. "1. A boy, 5. Rosa nodded like this, confirmed something she already suspected. "Then you tell them you'll take any shift they give you, and you mean it. And then you go home and figure out the childcare after. Never let them see you hesitate on a shift. They remember who hesitates." She said it like a woman passing down a family recipe, and Claire understood, with a small ache, that this was survival wisdom offered freely, from one tired woman to another. The elevator up to the 14th floor was mirrored on 3 sides, and Claire caught her own reflection multiplied into infinity, a woman in a second-hand blazer trying to look like she belonged somewhere she had never been. She smoothed her hair one more time. She practiced the smile that didn't look desperate. She had gotten good at that smile over the last 5 years, good enough that most people never guessed what was underneath it. The Human Resources office turned out to be a beige room with a woman named Sandra who barely looked up from her screen. "Fill this out. Initial here, here, and here. We'll call you if there's an opening." The posting said immediate opening, Claire said, keeping her voice level, the way you keep a hand level when you're carrying something that might spill. Sandra glanced at her then, really looked, the way people did sometimes when they were deciding how much effort a person was worth. "It is immediate, but we like to have the building owner sign off on new hires personally. He's particular." She said it like an apology and a warning both. "He's up on 19. You want to go now, or you want to come back?" Claire thought about the 11 blocks home, and the bus fare she didn't have for a second trip, and Toby waiting at Mrs. Alvarez's apartment with the promise that Mommy would be back before dinner. "I'll go now." The 19th floor was a different building entirely. The carpet went from serviceable to silent, the kind that swallowed footsteps whole. There was a corner office with the door half open, and a woman at a desk outside it who Claire would later learn was named Priya, who looked at the resume folder in Claire's hands and said, not unkindly, "He's got 5 minutes before his next call. Go on in." Claire's hand was steady on the door. That was the first thing she noticed about herself. Later, thinking back how steady her hand was, how she had trained herself over 5 years of hard mornings to never let her hands shake in front of someone who might be deciding whether to help her or not. She pushed the door open. The man behind the desk had his head down, signing something, and all Claire could see at first was a dark head of hair going gray at the temples in a way that looked expensive, a jaw she couldn't place, shoulders under a suit that fit like it had been made for exactly this body and no other. He didn't look up right away. He said, "1 second," in a voice that was doing 3 things at once: polite, distracted, tired in a way that money hadn't fixed. Claire stood in the doorway and waited, and somewhere in the 2 seconds before he lifted his head, she noticed something small and strange, the way his pen tapped twice against the desk before he set it down. Twice, not once, not 3 times. A habit. She had seen that habit before, a long time ago, on a rooftop in a different city, on a boy who used to tap his pencil the same way while he did math homework he hated, twice against his knee, like punctuation. She told herself it was nothing. Lots of people tapped things twice. He looked up. For a moment, neither of them said anything at all, and the silence in that office was so complete that Claire could hear the air conditioning cycle on somewhere above the ceiling tiles, could hear her own pulse arrive late to the conversation her body was already having, without her permission. His face did something complicated, surprise first, unguarded and total, and then something that looked almost like fear, and then, worst of all, something that looked like relief, like a man finding a photograph he thought he'd lost. Espera, he almost said, and caught himself, because they had never spoken Spanish to each other, not really, that had been someone else's story, some other version of this moment happening in Claire's mind, in a language that didn't belong here. What he actually said was her name. Just that. Not hello, not can I help you. Her name, like it was the only word left in him. Claire felt the folder in her hands go slightly damp where her fingers gripped it. She had exactly one choice available to her in this office, and she made it in less time than it took her heart to finish its next beat. She straightened her spine the way Rosa had probably straightened hers 1,000 times in this same building, and she said, in a voice she had to build from scratch in that instant, cool and pleasant and entirely, professionally blank, "I'm here about the custodial position. Sandra downstairs sent me up. I understand you like to sign off on new hires personally." Something in his face closed, very slightly, like a door easing shut without quite latching. "Of course," he said. "Sit down." She sat. He looked at the folder she'd set on the desk, at her name printed at the top of a resume that listed 3 years of bookkeeping work that had ended when the company folded, then 2 years of gaps that she had learned to describe as family responsibilities because the truth that her son's father had left before the birth, and she had spent 2 years surviving on whatever work would take a woman with a baby on her hip, was not the kind of truth you put on a resume. "Bennett," he said, reading it aloud, testing the sound of it like it was a word in a language he used to speak fluently and had almost forgotten. "That's not the name He stopped himself. "It's my name," Claire said simply, and let the sentence end there, offering nothing more, daring him with her silence to say what he clearly wanted to say and didn't. He didn't. He looked at her for a long moment, and Claire made herself hold his eyes without flinching, because she had learned, in 5 years of asking people for things she desperately needed, that the moment you looked away was the moment you lost whatever ground you'd been standing on. His eyes were the same brown they had always been. That, at least, hadn't changed with the suit and the building and the 15 years. "You're overqualified for a custodial position," he said finally, tapping the resume with one finger. "Twice. Bookkeeping. Some college. I need work that pays weekly," Claire said, "not work that matches my resume. The custodial position pays bi-weekly. Then I'll take it anyway." She kept her voice even. "Unless there's a reason you won't hire me." It was a small trap, and she watched him understand that it was a trap, watched him realize that if he said no, he would have to explain why, and there was no explanation he could give in this room that wouldn't require saying a name from 15 years ago out loud. She watched him decide, in real time, to let her have this. "Monday," he said. "7 a.m., East Wing. You'll report to Rosa." "Thank you." Claire stood, gathered the folder, and made it almost to the door before his voice stopped her, quieter now, without the businesslike edge. "How have you—" He didn't finish it. Couldn't, maybe. She turned halfway, enough to be polite, not enough to give him her whole face. "I've been fine," she said, which was a lie built from the same steel that had gotten her out of bed every hard morning for 5 years, and she left before he could hear the lie in it. In the elevator, alone, mirrored on 3 sides, Claire finally let her hands shake. She didn't cry until she was 6 blocks away, past the reflection of the building, in front of a laundromat with a broken sign that only lit up the letters L-U-N. She stood there with her back against the brick and let herself have 90 seconds of it, no more, because 90 seconds was what she'd learned she could afford before her face gave everything away to strangers on the sidewalk. Then she wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, checked her reflection in the laundromat window to make sure the damage wasn't visible, and started walking toward Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, where a 5-year-old boy was waiting with 100 questions about how the interview went, none of which had anything to do with the man behind the desk on the 19th floor. Toby ran the last 10 feet down the hallway when he saw her, the way he always did, like she might be a mirage that would vanish if he walked instead of ran. She caught him and lifted him, even though her arms ached and the doctor had told her twice to stop lifting a 5-year-old like he was still 2, because some habits weren't about practicality, they were about proof to both of them that she would always be there to catch him. "Did you get it?" he asked into her shoulder. "I got it, baby." Was the man nice? Claire thought of the pen tapping twice against the desk, of the way his face had opened up for one unguarded second before closing again, of the way he had let her have the lie about being fine. "He was fine," she said. "Come on, let's go home and I'll make the good noodles." That night, after Toby was asleep, with one arm flung over the edge of his mattress like he was still learning where the bed ended, Claire sat at the small kitchen table in their rented room and allowed herself, for the first time in 15 years, to remember Nathan Hale on purpose. Not the accidental memories that ambushed her sometimes, a song on someone else's radio, the smell of a particular aftershave in a crowded elevator, the sight of a young couple on a rooftop somewhere, laughing about nothing. Those came uninvited, and she had learned to survive them the way you survive weather. This was different. This was choosing to open the door. She remembered him at 17, skinny in a way that made his elbows look like they belonged to someone else, with a scholarship letter in his pocket that he'd shown her before he'd shown anyone, sitting on the flat roof of the apartment building where they'd both grown up, the city lights spread out below them like something they might someday deserve. She remembered him saying, "I'm going to get us both out of here," and believing him completely, the way you believe things at 17, without any evidence except the size of your own hope. And she remembered the morning 3 weeks later when she'd knocked on his door and his mother had answered and said, gently, that he'd left before dawn, that the scholarship program wanted him early, that he'd left a letter, 3 lines. She had read those 3 lines so many times over the following year that she could still recite them from memory, sitting here at this kitchen table 15 years, and 1 abandoned pregnancy, and 1 difficult son later. "I have to do this alone. I'll write when I know what my life looks like. Don't wait for me." He had never written. Claire put her palms flat on the table and breathed until the old ache settled back into its familiar shape, the shape she'd built a life around, the shape that fit inside her like a second skeleton. Then she got up, checked on Toby one more time, and went to bed, because Monday was coming whether she was ready for it or not, and 7 a.m. did not care about the wait of 15 years. Rosa handed her a gray uniform on Monday morning and said, "Break rooms this way, and don't let anyone tell you the 4th floor supply closet has extra rags. It doesn't. We all fight over the same 12 rags." And Claire found, in the specificity of this complaint, something steadying. There was a whole world here of small, practical problems that had nothing to do with 15 years of silence, and she wanted very badly to live in that world instead of the other one. For the first week, it worked. She learned the building, the way you learn any building, when your job is to know every corner of it better than the people who live there, the stairwell that always smelled faintly of bleach, no matter how many times you cleaned. Eat, the seventh-floor tenant who left protein shake residue on every surface like a crime scene. The elevator on the east side that stuck for exactly 4 seconds before the doors opened, long enough that you learned to brace for it and stop being startled. She kept her head down. She wore the uniform like armor. She told herself that a building this size, with this many floors and this many employees, could easily let an owner and a custodian go weeks without crossing paths if both people wanted it that way badly enough. She was wrong within 4 days. She was mopping the executive floor hallway 19, the floor she'd sworn to herself she would find any excuse to avoid when she felt it before she saw it, that particular quality of attention a person develops after being watched by the same person enough times to recognize the weight of it even with her back turned. She straightened, mop still in hand, and turned to find Nathan Hale standing exactly 6 feet away in the middle of a workday, on a floor that had no reason to require his attention to a mop bucket. "Good morning," he said. Just that. Not her name this time. He seemed to have learned something about restraint in the 4 days since her interview. "Good morning, sir," she said back, and the word sir landed between them like a small, deliberate wall. He didn't try to climb over it. He nodded once and walked on toward whatever meeting he was pretending he had a reason to attend on this side of the building, and Claire stood there with the mop dripping quietly onto the tile and told herself that this was fine, this was manageable. A man could walk past a hallway without it meaning anything at all. It happened again the next day, and the day after that, he never lingered. He never said more than a greeting, but he found reasons a coffee run to the ground-floor cafe at exactly the time she cleaned the lobby glass, a walk-through of the East Wing that a man who owned the building had absolutely no operational reason to conduct personally, a habit of taking the stairs instead of the elevator on days when Claire happened to be cleaning the stairwell landing. He never touched her. He never asked her anything personal. He simply kept appearing, quiet and patient, like weather that refused to pass. Rosa noticed before Claire admitted to herself that there was anything to notice. "He's not usually down here," Rosa said one afternoon, watching Nathan's retreating back from the far end of a hallway they'd just finished. She said it carefully, testing the water, the way people test water they suspect might be too hot to touch. "Mr. Hale. He runs this whole company from the top 3 floors. I've been cleaning here 2 years. I seen him maybe 6 times before you started." Claire kept her eyes on the baseboard she was wiping. "I wouldn't know anything about that." Rosa looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Claire felt it on the side of her face like sunlight, and then went back to her own section without another word. But Claire understood, in the quality of that silence, that Rosa had decided something, not to pry. Not yet, but to watch. Rosa needed this job the way Claire needed this job, and a woman who needed a job that badly learned early which fires were worth putting out and which ones you let burn quietly at a safe distance, because getting close enough to help could cost you the ground you stood on. By the 2nd week, Claire had started arriving 10 minutes early and leaving her cleaning cart in a different spot each day. Small, evasive maneuvers that she was embarrassed to admit to herself she was making. It didn't matter. He found her anyway, not through any tracking or scheming, just through the simple, stubborn geography of a man who owned every floor and had nowhere else he particularly wanted to be. The 3rd week began on a Tuesday that started wrong before it started at all. Mrs. Alvarez called at 6:45 in the morning, her voice tight with an apology Claire could hear before the words even arrived. Her sister had been in an accident, 3 states away. Not serious, but serious enough that Mrs. Alvarez needed to leave within the hour, needed to be on a plane by 9, and there was no one else, no backup, no cousin or neighbor who could take Toby on 4 minutes' notice on a Tuesday. Claire stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and did the math she had done 100 times in 5 years of single motherhood. The math where every option costs something, and the question is only ever which cost you can survive. If she called in sick, she lost a shift she couldn't afford to lose, 3 weeks into a job where her reliability was the only currency she had. If she left Toby alone in the rented room, even for a few hours, she would spend every minute at work sick with a fear that had no bottom to it. There was no version of this morning that didn't hurt. She chose the version where she could see him. "You have to be so quiet," she told Toby in the elevator up to the East Wing service entrance, crouched down to his eye level, holding both his small shoulders like she could transfer some of her own steadiness directly into his body through her hands. "You stay in the supply closet with your crayons, and you don't come out, not for anything, okay? Not even if you get bored. Especially not if you get bored." Toby, 5 years old and solemn in the way only children who have absorbed their mother's anxiety can be solemn, nodded with the gravity of a soldier accepting orders. "I won't come out," he said. "I promise, Mommy." For 2 hours it worked. Claire moved through her section with her senses stretched thin, half her mind on baseboards and half on the closet 3 floors below, and every 10 minutes she found an excuse to check on him, a dropped rag she needed, a fresh bottle of cleaner, and every 10 minutes he was exactly where she'd left him, drawing careful crayon dinosaurs on the backs of old invoice forms Rosa had scavenged for him. On the 11th check, he wasn't there. Claire felt her whole body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning, and she moved through the service hallway, calling his name in a whisper that scraped her throat raw with the effort of staying quiet, because some animal part of her brain understood that a screaming woman running through an executive floor looking for a lost child was a scene that would end her employment before she'd even found out if he was safe. She checked the stairwell. She checked the break room. She checked the elevator bank, her heart trying to climb out through her ribs, and that was where she heard it, a small voice, delighted, coming from around the corner by the executive offices, and a second voice, low and warm and utterly familiar, answering it. She rounded the corner and found her son sitting cross-legged on the expensive carpet of the 19th floor, in the middle of a workday, showing Nathan Hale a crayon drawing of what appeared to be a stegosaurus wearing a business tie. Nathan was crouched down at Toby's level, his suit jacket pooling slightly on the carpet in a way that would have horrified anyone who understood what that jacket cost. His full attention on the drawing, with an expression Claire had never once seen him wear in that office. Unguarded, absorbed, almost young. "Does the stegosaurus work here too?" he was asking, with the total seriousness 5-year-olds require and rarely receive from adults. "He's the boss," Toby explained, like this was obvious, "but nobody knows because he's a dinosaur and dinosaurs aren't supposed to have jobs." "That seems like it would be a problem for payroll," Nathan said gravely, and Toby laughed the real laugh, the unself-conscious one that Claire hadn't heard from him in longer than she wanted to admit. Not since before things had gotten hard enough that even a 5-year-old learned to read the weather in his mother's face before he laughed at anything. Claire's fear turned to something else the moment she was sure he was safe, something hot and scattered that she had to work to organize into words. "Toby." Her voice came out sharper than she meant it to, sharp with the aftershock of terror. "I told you to stay in the closet." Toby's face fell instantly, the particular collapse of a child who understands, without being told, that he has done something that frightened his mother badly. "I'm sorry, Mommy. I got bored and I just wanted to see the elevator with the mirrors, and then I found the nice man and he said I could stay." Nathan stood, unfolding himself from the floor, and for once there was no calculation in his expression at all. None of the careful watching Claire had grown used to. "He wasn't any trouble," he said, and then, before Claire could gather the apology already forming in her mouth, he added, quietly, looking at her directly, "You have a wonderful son. You're raising him well." It was so far from what Claire had braced herself for, the reprimand, the disappointment, the quiet reminder that a child in the executive suite during business hours was a fireable offense, that for a moment she didn't have any response prepared at all. She had built her entire posture, her entire 5 years of armor, around the expectation of being punished for needing help. She had no framework ready for being told, by this particular man, in this particular building, that she was doing something right. "Thank you," she managed, and it came out smaller than she wanted it to, and she hated that it came out that way, and she took Toby's hand, and left before anything else could happen that she didn't have a rehearsed response for. That night, Toby talked about the nice man who drew dinosaurs for 20 minutes straight, unprompted, while Claire made dinner with her back to him so he wouldn't see her face while he did it. The days that followed rearranged themselves around a new gravity that Claire hadn't chosen and couldn't seem to stop. Toby, who had never met his own father and had absorbed, in the wordless way children absorb things, that this was a hole in his life he wasn't supposed to ask about too often, had decided independently that the nice man from the 19th floor was worth asking about constantly. Is the dinosaur boss man going to be there today? Can we say hi to him? Does he like the color of this drawing? Claire found herself in the impossible position of being unable to explain to a 5-year-old why the answer to all of this needed to be complicated, when to him it was simple. There was a kind adult in the building who paid attention to him, and attention, to a child who had never had enough of it from a father, was a kind of gold he wasn't willing to give up easily. Nathan never used this. That was the thing Claire kept turning over at night, unable to find the crack in it. He never sent messages through Toby. He never asked Toby questions about his mother, never used the boy's affection as a lever to pry open the door Claire kept locked. He simply, consistently, without any apparent agenda, was kind to a child who needed kindness, and every time Claire caught him at it, teaching Toby to fold a paper airplane in the break room during a 15-minute stretch of downtime, letting Toby help carry a stack of folders that were clearly too light to need any help at all, she felt another small piece of the wall she'd built come loose in its foundation, and she hated how much that scared her. And she hated, more quietly, underneath the fear, how much it didn't. By the middle of that 3rd week, a whisper had started moving through the custodial staff, low and ugly the way rumors always start low and ugly, in break rooms and supply closets, where people with very little power say the cruel things they can't say anywhere that might cost them their jobs. Claire heard the edges of it before she heard the whole thing, a pause when she entered a room, a look exchanged between 2 co-workers she barely knew, the word favorite said with a weight that made clear it wasn't a compliment. She caught the full version by accident, coming around a corner with a fresh bag of trash liners, and heard a woman named Denise saying to another co-worker, not troubling to lower her voice enough, "And you know why she got hired so fast? And why he keeps finding reasons to be down here? It's not exactly a mystery, is it?" Claire stood very still in the hallway with the bag of liners cold and plastic in her hand, and felt something in her chest crack down the middle, quiet and precise, like ice under a boot. This was the exact thing she had been most afraid of from the very first day, not that people would know, but that they would decide, without knowing anything true at all, that she had gotten here on her knees instead of on her feet. She walked into the break room instead of away from it. Denise's face went carefully blank when she saw her. Claire set the bag of liners down with more control than she felt and said, in a voice that came out steadier than she had any right to expect, "I clean toilets on the 14th floor and mop floors on this one. I earn my paycheck the same way everyone in this room does. Whatever you think you know, you don't." She let the silence sit for a moment, long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough to be a choice rather than an accident. "I'd appreciate it if you kept your imagination to yourself." She left the room with her chin level and her hands steady, and it wasn't until she was alone in the stairwell 3 floors down that she let her hands shake, pressed flat against the cool concrete wall, breathing until the shaking stopped. She hadn't planned to tell Nathan about it, and she didn't have to, Rosa told him. Claire found this out 2 days later, when the whispering in the break room stopped as abruptly as it had started, and when she asked Rosa, carefully, sideways, what had happened, Rosa gave her a look that mixed satisfaction with something almost like pride. "He didn't name you," Rosa said, wiping down the break room counter with unnecessary thoroughness, not quite meeting Claire's eyes. "Called a whole staff meeting, real quiet about it, no drama. Said this company doesn't run on rumors about who's sleeping with who. Said anybody caught spreading that kind of talk about a coworker's going to have a conversation with HR they won't enjoy. Said everybody here earns their position through their work and nothing else. And if anyone had a problem with how somebody else got hired, they could bring it to him directly instead of the break room." Rosa finally looked up. Didn't say your name once. Didn't have to. Claire stood with a mop handle in her hand and felt something complicated move through her chest. Gratitude, yes, warm and immediate, but underneath it something more unsettling, the recognition that he had understood exactly what she needed, which was not to be rescued in a way that made her the center of attention, but to be protected in a way that let her keep her dignity intact. He had known that about her 15 years ago too. She remembered suddenly how he used to walk the long way around, a group of loud boys from the next building over, so she wouldn't have to be seen needing an escort, how he'd figured out that her pride mattered to her more than her safety did, and had learned to protect the pride first. She hated that he still knew how to do that. She hated it because it made him harder to hate, and hating him had been load-bearing in the structure of her life for a very long time. That night, after Toby was asleep, Claire lay awake in the dark and admitted to herself, in words for the first time since the interview, that the version of Nathan Hale she'd spent 15 years building in her mind, the coward, the boy who ran, the man who would have grown selfish and cold with all that money, was not the man standing in front of her now, and that the gap between the story she needed to survive on and the truth in front of her had gotten too wide to keep pretending it wasn't there. The invitation to Diane Marsh's office came through Priya on a Thursday, delivered with the particular careful blankness of an assistant who has been instructed to reveal nothing about what's coming. "Mrs. Marsh would like to speak with you," Priya said. 22nd floor, 3 o'clock. She said it's an administrative matter. Claire had never been to the 22nd floor. Nobody on the custodial staff had it belong to the board. A floor above, even Nathan's, all glass and silence and the particular hush of a place where enormous decisions got made by people who never had to clean up after themselves. She arrived at 2:58, with her hands folded in front of her, wearing her uniform because she hadn't been given any indication she should wear anything else, and immediately understood, from the way the receptionist looked at her, that this had been the wrong choice, or perhaps the exactly right one, depending on what Diane Marsh wanted from this meeting. Diane's office looked out over the whole city, floor-to-ceiling glass with the afternoon light coming in gold and merciless. Diane herself was seated behind a desk that held nothing but a single closed folder and a glass of water she never touched. A woman somewhere past 60, who had the kind of elegance that had been curated for decades, silver hair cut with surgical precision, a cardigan that cost more than Claire's monthly rent, reading glasses she wore pushed up into her hair rather than on her face, as though she'd never needed them for anything as simple as reading a person correctly. "Sit down," Diane said, and it wasn't unkind exactly. It was worse than unkind. It was the tone of someone speaking to a problem she intended to solve efficiently. Claire sat. "I'll be direct," Diane said, folding her hands on the closed folder. "I know who you are, not your job title. I know that you knew Nathan before either of you had any money, and I know he's been finding excuses to be on the lower floors since you started, and I know that his assistant has commented on it, and his driver has commented on it, and now I'm commenting on it, which means it's no longer a private matter, Miss Bennett. It's a company matter." Claire kept her hands still in her lap, kept her spine straight, kept her face arranged into the same careful neutrality she'd worn into Nathan's office 3 weeks ago. "I'm not sure what you're asking me." "I'm not asking you anything yet." Diane's voice stayed level, pleasant even, which made it worse. "I'm telling you something, and then I'm going to make you an offer, and I'd like you to hear both before you decide how to feel about either." She leaned back slightly. "I've known Nathan since he was 22 years old and had exactly one good suit and more ambition than sense. I have spent 19 years building this company alongside him, and I've spent a considerable portion of the last 3 arranging a merger with the Callaway Group that depends, in no small part, on a personal alliance between our families, an alliance that requires Nathan's full, undistracted focus, and frankly, requires him to be seen as a man whose life is exactly as controlled and impressive as his balance sheet." She paused. Men like Nathan get a certain kind of story told about them when they're photographed with someone from his own world. They get a very different story told about them when a tabloid finds out the man is quietly infatuated with a custodial employee who has a child by another man. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's true, and because you strike me as someone who has had to live inside the truth for a long time, whether you liked it or not. Claire felt each sentence land like a small, precise blow, aimed with a surgeon's understanding of exactly where the soft tissue was. It was true, all of it. The parts that were true: that she was a custodial worker, that Toby's father had left, that the world Diane Marsh lived in had rules Claire had never been taught and would never fully learn. The cruelty of it wasn't in the lie. The cruelty was in how precisely it was aimed at the truth. "He'll be encapsulated by this," Diane went on, quieter now, almost gentle, which was somehow the worst register of all. Men like him fall into these stories for a season, the nostalgia of it, the drama. It flatters something in them. And then the season ends, because it always does, because the gap between his world and yours doesn't close just because two people wish it would. And when it ends, Miss Bennett, you'll be the one left standing in the wreckage. You and your son. Diane opened the folder finally, turned it around so Claire could see the check inside. The number on it more money than Claire had held in her hands in the entirety of the last 5 years combined. "I'd like to make this simple for both of you. Take this, resign quietly, and go somewhere that doesn't require you to watch a man decide, eventually, that you don't belong in his life. I promise you, it will hurt less now than it will in a year." For one long, ugly moment, the offer looked like mercy. Claire felt the pull of it in her chest. The exhaustion of 5 years finally offered an exit, a number large enough to mean security for Toby that had nothing to do with hoping a rich man's affection would survive contact with his own world. She thought of the leaking faucet in their rented room. She thought of Toby's shoes, a half size too small for a month now because there hadn't been room in the budget. She thought of how easy it would be to simply take this and disappear, and never have to find out whether Diane Marsh was right. And then something older than the exhaustion straightened her spine. The same something that had gotten her through a pregnancy alone, through 2 years of gap-filled resumes, through 100 mornings when giving up, would have been so much easier than getting up. She thought of walking into Nathan's office 3 weeks ago and refusing to let him see her flinch. She thought of what it would mean to walk out of this room with that check in her hand. Not what it would give her, but what it would take. "I'm not going to take your money," Claire said, and her voice came out steady, steadier than she'd expected, steady in the exact way that had carried her through every hard room she'd ever had to sit in. "Not because I don't need it. God knows I need it. But because I didn't ask him for anything, Mrs. Marsh. I didn't ask for the job, and I didn't ask for his attention. And I'm not going to be bought out of a life I haven't actually chosen yet. If I leave, if this ends the way you think it will, it's going to be my decision, not yours, not a number on a piece of paper." She stood, smoothing her uniform with hands that had gone very still and very sure. "And for what it's worth, I'd think carefully about measuring a person's worth by their bank account in front of someone who cleans up after people who have a great deal more money than sense. You'd be surprised how much you learn about people from what they leave behind in a wastebasket." She walked out of that office with her chin level and her hands steady, and it wasn't until she reached the stairwell she couldn't make herself wait for the elevator, couldn't stand the thought of being trapped in a small mirrored box with her own reflection right now, that the full weight of what had just happened caught up with her, and she sat down hard on the concrete steps and put her head in her hands and let herself shake, silently, for a long time. She didn't tell Nathan. She told herself this was pride, and it was, but it was also something more complicated, a kind of protective calculus she'd been running her whole adult life, the math of deciding what a person could handle knowing without it costing them something they couldn't afford to lose. If she told him about Diane, he would have to choose, publicly, in a way he might not be ready for, and Claire had learned the hard way, 15 years ago, exactly what happened when a scared young man was asked to choose between the life waiting for him and the girl who loved him. She had no interest in finding out what a scared rich man would choose, given the same test with higher stakes. So instead, she did the thing she knew how to do. She retreated. She started arriving exactly on time instead of 10 minutes early. She stopped making eye contact in the hallways. When Nathan appeared, and he still appeared, quieter now, more careful, as if some instinct told him something had shifted. Even without being told what, she answered his greetings with the flattest, most professional monosyllables she could manage, and she watched something in his face fold inward each time she did it. And she told herself this was necessary, this was protection. This was the only kind of love she had left in her to give either of them, the kind that got out before it could be taken away. Toby noticed before Nathan said anything about it out loud. Children always noticed the weather before adults admitted there was a storm. It happened on a Tuesday night, over a dinner of the good noodles, Toby's fork moving listlessly through his bowl instead of the usual enthusiastic assault. "Mommy," he said, in the careful voice he used when he was working up to a question he suspected might be dangerous. "Did I do something bad?" Claire's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "What?" "No, baby, of course not. Why would you think that?" "Because we didn't see the dinosaur boss man all week." Toby's eyes were fixed very intently on his bowl, the particular intensity of a child bracing for bad news. "And you got quiet again. Like when Daddy left." He looked up then, and his eyes were bright with something too old for his face. A 5-year-old's fluent, terrible understanding of the specific silence that meant someone he loved was about to disappear. "Is he going away too?" Claire set her fork down very carefully, because her hands had started to shake, and she didn't trust herself to hold anything sharp. She had built her entire life around the promise that Toby would never have to feel this particular fear again, the fear of loving someone and watching them go, and here it was anyway, delivered by her own silence, her own careful retreat, the exact thing she had been trying to protect him from becoming the thing that hurt him. "No," she said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable, and she hated that it cracked, and she let it crack anyway because Toby deserved the truth even in pieces. "No, baby, he's not going anywhere. I got scared about some grown-up things and I made a mistake, and I think I need to fix it." Toby considered this with the grave seriousness of a small judge weighing evidence. "You should tell him you're scared," he said finally, with the devastating simplicity that only children have access to, the simplicity that comes from not yet having learned all the reasons adults find to complicate the truth. "That's what you tell me when I'm scared. You say the scared thing out loud, and it gets smaller." Claire looked at her son across a table in a rented room in a city that had never once made anything easy for either of them, and felt something break open in her chest that had been sealed for 15 years, and understood, with a clarity that felt like falling, that she had spent 5 years teaching her son to name his fears out loud, specifically so he wouldn't have to carry them the way she had carried hers silently, alone, until they calcified into something too heavy to ever set down. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the dark running the math again, not the math of money this time, but the older, harder math of risk, the math that asked what it would cost to say the scared thing out loud versus what it had already cost her, every day for 15 years, to never say it at all. She thought about Diane Marsh's check sitting unclaimed in a folder somewhere, about the version of her own future that check represented safe, small, permanently closed. She thought about Nathan's face folding inward every time she answered him in monosyllables, and understood, with a guilt that settled into her stomach like a stone, that she had been doing to him exactly what he had once done to her, leaving without an explanation, letting silence do the work that honesty was too frightening to do. By morning, she had decided something, though she wasn't yet sure what shape the decision would take. She dressed for work in her uniform as always, packed Toby off to Mrs. Alvarez's with a kiss and a promise to explain everything to him that evening, whatever everything turned out to be, and walked the 11 blocks to the Aldermont residences with her resignation letter folded in her coat pocket, unsigned, because some part of her still wasn't sure whether she was walking toward an ending or away from one. She found out which before she'd even finished her shift. She was on the 14th floor when Rosa found her, moving fast for a woman who'd spent 30 years learning to move efficiently rather than urgently, her face tight, with something between alarm and barely contained fury. You need to get up to 19, Rosa said, low and fast. Now, there's a whole board meeting happening up there and it is not staying quiet. And I heard your name, not your job, your actual name come out of Diane Marsh's mouth in a sentence I did not like the sound of. Claire's stomach dropped straight through the floor. She left her cart exactly where it stood, took the stairs 2 at a time because she couldn't stand the thought of the elevator's slow, mirrored patience, and arrived on the executive floor breathless, her uniform sticking to her back with sweat, just in time to hear Diane Marsh's voice carrying clearly through the half-open door of the largest conference room on the floor, pitched for an audience of a dozen board members in expensive suits. And I think it's worth asking this board whether the man we're about to hand a merger worth 11 figures is exhibiting the kind of judgment we should be comfortable with when he's spending his working hours pursuing a member of the custodial staff who, by all accounts, arrived here with a fabricated resume and a convenient personal history. That's enough, Diane. Nathan's voice, quiet, but with an edge in it Claire had never heard from him before, not once in 3 weeks of careful, patient watching. You don't get to stand in this room and use a woman's life as a negotiating chip because you're afraid of losing your seat at this table if the Callaway deal goes sideways. There was a silence in that room that Claire could feel through the door. The particular silence of a dozen powerful people recalibrating their understanding of a situation in real time. I built this company alongside you, Diane said, her voice tighter now, the composure cracking at the edges. I have spent 19 years. You've spent 19 years being someone I owe an enormous amount to, Nathan said, cutting through it, and I have never once forgotten that. But you don't own my life, Diane. You never did. And the woman you just described in front of 12 people who don't know her, that fabricated resume, you mentioned she has 3 years of bookkeeping experience and 2 years of raising a child alone after his father left before he was born. She has never once asked me for anything since the day she walked into my office needing a job. She has, in fact, spent the last several weeks going out of her way to make sure I understood she wanted absolutely nothing from me at all. If that's a woman running some kind of scheme, she's remarkably bad at it. His voice had gone very quiet now. The quiet Claire remembered from 15 years ago. The quiet he'd always used right before he said something he meant completely. 15 years ago, I left the only person who ever loved me without asking anything of me, because I was young and scared, and I let someone convince me that the life I was building required leaving behind everything that mattered. I'm not doing that again. Not for a merger. Not for this board. Not for you, no matter how much I owe you. Claire stood frozen outside the door, one hand pressed flat against the wall, and felt something in her chest that she had spent 15 years keeping carefully, deliberately closed, come open all at once, not with drama, not with fireworks, but with the quiet, total finality of a lock finally turning after a very long time rusted shut. She understood, standing there, why she had recognized him instantly, that first day, across a desk in an office that smelled like new carpet, not because of a coincidence, not because the universe had arranged some elaborate trick of fate, but simply because she had never, in 15 years, actually stopped knowing him. The tap of a pen against a desk, the particular quiet before he said something he meant. She had spent 5 years building a fortress specifically designed to survive without him, and she had never once needed the fortress to forget him because she never had. The board meeting broke without a formal resolution, which in the strange arithmetic of corporate power meant something significant had shifted anyway. Claire had retreated back down the stairwell before anyone could find her standing outside the door, her heart going too fast, her mind still catching up to what she'd heard, and she was sitting on the same concrete steps where she'd broken down after Diane's office 3 days earlier when Nathan found her. He didn't say anything at first. He simply sat down beside her on the cold step, still in his suit jacket. A man who owned 30 stories of glass and steel, choosing to lower himself onto industrial concrete in a stairwell that smelled faintly of bleach, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I heard," Claire said finally, because someone had to say something, and she had never once in her life been able to sit inside a silence that mattered without eventually filling it. "I figured you might have." He looked at his hands, folded loosely between his knees. I should have told you Diane came to see you. I found out this morning one of the board members mentioned it. Thought I already knew. I didn't. His jaw tightened. I'm sorry you had to sit in that office alone and hear her tell you what your life was worth. I didn't take the check, Claire said. It came out quieter than she meant it to, almost shy, an offering. I know. She told the whole room that too, right before I asked her to stop talking. A small, tired, almost smile. For what it's worth, refusing 11 figures worth of family alliance because you wouldn't take a payoff might be the single most impressive thing anyone's done in that boardroom in a decade. Claire looked at her own hands, at the calluses that hadn't been there 5 years ago, at the ring finger that had never once had anything on it. I've been avoiding you, she said, for days. On purpose. I told myself it was because I was protecting Toby, but that wasn't really it. She made herself keep going. Because Toby's voice was still in her head from the night before, you should tell him you're scared, that's what you tell me. I got scared. Diane didn't tell me anything. I didn't already believe on my own, somewhere underneath everything, that this was going to end the way it ended before, that I was going to let myself hope again and then watch you disappear back into the life that actually makes sense for you. Her voice thinned but held. I've spent 15 years building myself into someone who doesn't need anyone to stay. It's the only way I knew how to survive what you did the first time. And some part of me has been terrified since the day I walked into your office that letting you back in even a little bit meant I'd have to find out whether I could survive it a second time. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had none of the boardroom edge left in it at all. I was 17, he said. And I want to tell you it was more complicated than fear, but it wasn't, not really. I got a letter that said I could leave the only life I'd ever known. And instead of trusting that we could figure out a way through it together, I convinced myself I was protecting you by leaving you nothing to hold on to. I told myself if I took you with me and it went badly, I'd have ruined 2 lives instead of 1. I wrote that letter and tore it up 11 times before I sent the version I sent, because I couldn't find the words that would make leaving you sound like anything other than exactly what it was, which was a coward's decision dressed up as a sacrifice. He looked at her directly now. I've spent 15 years telling myself a story where leaving was the responsible thing. Watching you walk into my office 3 weeks ago and refuse to let me see you break was the moment that story finally fell apart, because the woman standing in front of me hadn't needed saving from anything. She'd built an entire life out of steel with her bare hands, and I understood, looking at you, exactly how much I'd cost you by not being there to help carry any of it. I don't need you to carry it now, Claire said, and it came out sharper than she intended, an old reflex firing before she could stop it. She heard herself and softened, immediately, unable to bear the flash of hurt that crossed his face. That's not I don't mean that the way it sounded. I mean I've learned how to carry it. I'm good at it now. I'm not looking for someone to rescue me, Nathan. I don't think I'd know what to do with rescuing, even if you offered it. I'm not offering to rescue you, he said. I watched you refuse 11 figures rather than let someone buy your dignity out from under you. I think you'd set fire to anything that looked like a rescue before it got within 10 feet of you, and honestly, that's one of the things He stopped himself, visibly, and started again more carefully. I'm not asking to fix your life. I'm asking for the chance to be in it. There's a difference, and I think you know there's a difference, even if it's hard to trust that I mean it. Claire studied him in the fluorescent light of the stairwell, this man who had once been a boy tapping a pencil twice against his knee on a rooftop, who had built an empire out of the fear he'd carried away from that rooftop 15 years ago, who had just, an hour earlier, told a room full of powerful people that he wasn't willing to trade her dignity for a merger. She thought about the dinosaur drawings taped to Toby's wall. She thought about the paper airplane Nathan had taught her son to fold, the careful, patient way he'd found to be present in Toby's life, without ever once using that presence as leverage against her. He asks about you every night, she said finally. Toby. He thinks you're a secret dinosaur boss, and he cried a little on Tuesday because he thought you'd left because of something he did. She felt her throat tighten. I can survive you leaving me again, Nathan. I've had practice. I don't know if I can survive watching you leave him. Then let me answer that the only way that actually means anything, Nathan said. Not with words. Words are cheap. I already used up my best ones 15 years ago, and they weren't worth much in the end. He stood, offered his hand to help her up from the concrete step, and when she took it, the warmth of his palm against hers felt like something she'd been braced against for weeks finally allowed to land. Let me show you, over time, instead of promising you now. I'm not asking you to trust the words. I'm asking you to let me earn it, the slow way, the only way that's ever actually true. That was, in the end, exactly what he did. He didn't send flowers to the break room or make grand declarations that would have humiliated her in front of coworkers already primed to gossip. He did something far more difficult and, Claire came to understand, far more valuable. He showed up, consistently, in the smallest and least glamorous ways available to him. He learned Toby's school pickup schedule and asked, carefully, whether it would be all right if he came along sometimes, not to replace anything, just to be there. He sat at the kitchen table in Claire's rented room, the actual rented room, with its water stain on the ceiling and its second-hand furniture, no attempt made to relocate the visit somewhere more comfortable for him, and help Toby with a worksheet about counting by fives, patient through every wrong answer, never once glancing at his watch. He was there on a Tuesday when Toby had a fever and Claire had to call in sick, dropping off soup from the diner down the street without being asked, leaving it with Mrs. Alvarez rather than insisting on coming in himself, understanding without being told that Claire needed the space to handle it herself and only wanted to know, quietly, that someone had thought of them. He was there on a Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that. Claire watched this accumulate the way you watch trust. Accumulate not in one dramatic moment, but in the slow arithmetic of 100 small ones, each one a data point against the fear she'd carried for 15 years. The constancy did what no grand gesture could have done. It didn't overwhelm her defenses. It simply outlasted them, the way water outlasts stone, until one evening in early autumn, sitting in the small park near her building, watching Toby chase a soccer ball across the grass, with a joy that had nothing careful or watchful in it at all, Claire heard herself say, out loud, the thing she'd been circling for weeks. "I'm scared," she said, and let the sentence sit there, exposed, exactly the way Toby had told her to. "I'm scared this is going to end the way it did before. I don't know if that fear ever goes away completely, but I'm tired of letting it decide everything for me." She turned to look at him, at this man who had spent 2 months proving, in 100 small, unglamorous ways, that he had meant what he said in that stairwell. "I want to try. I don't have any guarantees to offer you. I just have I'm willing. That's what I have." Nathan didn't say anything grand. He simply reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and the two of them sat there in the fading light watching Toby run in circles for the pure joy of running, and something between them settled into place, quietly, the way the truest things always do. The weeks that followed carried a different texture than anything Claire had allowed herself in 15 years. She kept working at the Aldermont residences. She insisted on this, firmly. When Nathan gently raised the possibility of something easier, and he'd had the good sense to hear the firmness in her voice and drop it immediately, understanding that her dignity was not a problem to be solved with money, and never would be. Rosa noticed the shift, of course. In the particular way that women who have survived enough hard years develop an instinct for other women's happiness. And one afternoon, wiping down the break room counter with her usual thoroughness, she said, without looking up, "Good. About time somebody in this building got something they deserved instead of something they settled for, and that was the entire conversation, and it was enough." Toby's questions changed shape, too, over those weeks from, "Is he going away?" to, "When is he coming again?" to, one evening in October, delivered with the same devastating directness he'd used to diagnose his mother's fear months earlier, "Is Nathan going to be my dad now?" Claire had no rehearsed answer for that one. She looked at her son, at the hope sitting undisguised on his small face, and understood that some doors, once you let them open even a crack, ask you honest questions you can't answer with careful evasions anymore. "I don't know yet, baby," she said, "but I think he'd like that very much. And so would I." Nathan asked her to meet him on a Saturday in late October and gave no explanation beyond an address that turned out, when Claire's rideshare pulled up in front of it, to be the old apartment building where she'd grown up, narrower than she remembered, the brick more weathered. A building that had clearly seen better decades but was, unmistakably, still standing, still exactly where it had always been. Nathan was waiting on the sidewalk, and beside him stood Toby, dressed in his good sweater, practically vibrating with the effort of holding on to some secret he'd clearly been sworn to keep. "What is this?" Claire asked, looking up at the building, feeling something in her chest tighten with the particular ache of returning to a place that held 15 years of unresolved history in its brick and its stairwells. "You'll see," Nathan said, and took her hand, and Toby took her other one, and the three of them walked up 4 flights of a stairwell that smelled almost exactly the way Claire remembered, through a door propped open at the top that led out onto the roof. The roof was strung with small lights, simple ones, nothing elaborate, and there were a handful of potted flowers arranged along the low wall that Claire recognized, with a jolt, as the same kind she'd once told a 17-year-old boy she loved. In an offhand comment, she couldn't believe he'd remembered across 15 years and an entire different life. The city spread out below them in the same way it always had from this exact vantage point. Lights scattered out toward a horizon that had once looked to 2 teenagers with nothing but hope between them, like a promise instead of a warning. "This is where I told you I was going to get us out of here," Nathan said, and his voice wasn't steady, not entirely, for the first time since Claire had known him as an adult. "And then I did it wrong. I got myself out and I left you behind, and I spent 15 years telling myself that was somehow protecting you, when really it was just fear wearing a noble costume." He turned to face her fully. "It took me 15 years, and a lot of very expensive mistakes to understand what I actually promised you up here. It was never supposed to be about money, or a building with my name on the deed. It was supposed to be about not being alone anymore. That's the only promise that ever mattered, and it's the only one I broke, and I've spent every day since I found you again trying to figure out how to keep it properly this time." He knelt down, right there on the same rooftop, in front of the same skyline, and Claire felt her whole body go still, with a stillness that had nothing to do with fear this time. "I'm not offering you my fortune," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word, steadied, continued. "I know that's not what you want, and honestly, it was never the thing worth offering in the first place. What I'm offering you is the thing I should have offered 15 years ago and didn't have the courage for. I'm offering to stay, not for a season, not until something easier comes along. I want to marry you, Claire. I want to be there every ordinary Tuesday for the rest of my life. Not just the extraordinary ones. And if you'll let me," his voice caught on Toby's name, and he glanced at the boy standing beside them, eyes huge, breath held. "I'd like to be your father too, Toby, if that's something you'd want. Not to replace anything, just to be there, every day, for as long as you'll both have me." He opened a small box that held a ring simple enough that Claire understood immediately he'd chosen it deliberately. Without any of the ostentation, his money could have bought a ring meant to say, "I know you, I remember who you actually are," rather than "look what I can afford." Claire looked down at this man kneeling on the rooftop where they'd once been 2 frightened, hopeful teenagers with nothing but each other, and felt 15 years of carefully constructed certainty come apart all at once, not with grief this time, but with something that felt, astonishingly, like relief. She thought of the 11 blocks she'd walked in broken shoes to get to that first interview. She thought of Diane Marsh's check, unclaimed. She thought of Toby's small, wise voice telling her that scared things got smaller once you said them out loud. "Yes," she said, and it came out clear and certain and entirely her own. "Yes." Toby let out a whoop that startled a pigeon off the ledge and threw himself into the middle of the embrace before either adult had fully finished it, and the 3 of them stood tangled together on a rooftop under the first, closing a circle that had been left open for 15 years. The wedding, when it came 6 weeks later, was small in exactly the way Claire had insisted it be, not out of any residual insecurity about Nathan's world, but because she had learned, over 5 hard years, exactly what mattered and what didn't, and a room full of business associates she'd never met had never once made that list. They married in a modest community garden 2 blocks from the building where Claire had grown up, with folding chairs instead of pews. With Rosa in the second row wearing a hat she'd clearly saved for a special occasion, with Mrs. Alvarez dabbing her eyes before the ceremony had even properly started. Nathan had wanted to invite the board, out of some lingering sense of obligation, and Claire had gently but firmly told him this day belonged to the people who had actually shown up for either of them when it cost them something to do it, and he had listened and understood. And the guest list had shrunk accordingly, and neither of them regretted it for a single moment. Toby carried the rings down the makeshift aisle with a gravity that made the small gathered crowd laugh softly with affection, holding the small velvet pillow out in front of him like it contained something far more important than jewelry, which, in a way, it did. Claire walked toward Nathan in a dress that had cost a fraction of what most guests at his usual events would have expected, and she had never in her life felt more completely, unapologetically herself. The vows they exchanged were simple, unadorned by the kind of grand rhetoric either of them could easily have afforded to hire a writer for. Nathan promised, this time, to stay not through metaphor, not through poetry, but in the plainest words he had, because he had learned, finally, that plain and true mattered more than beautiful and empty. Claire promised that she had learned something too, over 15 hard years, that real love wasn't the kind that never failed, but the kind that, having failed once, found the courage to come back and stay anyway. After the ceremony, before the small reception properly began, Nathan knelt again this time, not for Claire, but in front of Toby, in front of the entire gathered crowd, and asked him, with the same seriousness he'd have used for any adult, whether he might have the boy's permission to be his father, properly, for good. Toby's answer came without a second's hesitation, delivered through tears that made half the guests reach for tissues, and the 3 of them held each other in the center of that small garden, while the people who actually loved them clapped through their own tears. And it was, everyone would later agree, a far better wedding than any amount of money could have purchased. The months that followed asked nothing extraordinary of them, and that, Claire came to understand, was the entire point. Nathan kept his promise in the smallest possible increments, over and over, the way a person keeps a promise that's actually meant. He was there on ordinary Tuesdays. He learned to make the good noodles the way Toby liked them, slightly overcooked, which had taken Claire 5 years to perfect, and Nathan considerably less time to appreciate. He taught Toby to ride a bicycle in the small park near their new home, a modest house, chosen by Claire, far smaller than anything in Nathan's previous life, because she had told him plainly that she needed to build their life from a foundation she recognized, and he had agreed without argument, understanding by then that what she needed mattered more than what he could afford. Claire never fully stopped bracing, in some small corner of herself, against the possibility of loss. 15 years leave marks that don't disappear just because the story finally turns kind. But the bracing grew quieter with each ordinary Tuesday that Nathan showed up exactly as promised, until one evening the following spring, watching from the porch as Nathan ran alongside Toby's bicycle with one hand hovering near the seat, ready to catch him, and knowing, both of them, that the catching was becoming less and less necessary, Claire understood that the fear had finally, quietly, stopped being the loudest voice in the room. She thought sometimes, in these ordinary moments, about the woman who had walked 11 blocks in broken shoes with $41 and a folder of paperwork, who had looked a man she loved and hated in equal measure directly in the eye and told him coolly that she was there about the custodial position. She was grateful to that woman, the one who had refused to let herself be recognized before she was ready, the one who had protected her own dignity with everything she had left. She understood now that the refusal to be known too soon hadn't been a rejection of love. It had been the only way she'd known to make sure that whatever came next was chosen freely, on her own terms, rather than granted to her out of pity, and it had worked exactly the way she'd needed it to, because the man who eventually earned his way back into her life had to do it the hard, slow, ordinary way. The only way that had ever actually meant anything at all. I keep coming back to that one line Toby says at the kitchen table, "You should tell him you're scared." That's what you tell me. A 5-year-old figured out in one sentence what it took his mother 15 years to learn, and honestly, I think that's usually how it goes. The people with the least power in a room are often the ones who see the truth of it most clearly. Here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever had someone in your life say the plain, obvious thing you'd spent years avoiding and had it actually work? Tell me about that moment in the comments. I want to hear it. If Claire and Nathan's slow, unglamorous version of getting back to each other landed with you the way it landed with me, I'd love it if you left a rating and let me know. It genuinely helps.